over 6.5 million subscribers across his YouTube channels, and over 2.25 billion views. I just want those numbers, that level of impact, to resonate in your head as we talk about Brian Barczyk and his early days especially. With that, let's jump back to the actual beginning of our story of the life of Brian Barczyk. Brian Henry Barczyk was born on September 6, 1969 near Detroit, Michigan. Brian's earliest memory is of looking at a ball python at the local aquarium. From his earliest days, he knew he wanted to spend his life working with reptiles. He just didn't know how yet. He often chased around the snakes he could find in his backyard of the local creek, and he's often stated that 2 snakes caught his attention during these years: the ball python and the emerald tree boa that he saw in photos. Every day on his walk home from school, he would stop by a pet store called the Pet Vendor, where he could look at the reptiles and the fish. Growing up with a single mother who often had to work long hours, Brian spent many of his days after school at the pet store, until finally, at just before the age of 14, he was offered a job taking care of the reptiles at the store. From this job, Brian learned how to take care of many species of reptiles. The Pet Vendor would eventually open up a second location, with Brian being the manager of the store, a job he would work until he went to breeding full-time. It was through this job at the Pet Vendor that Brian met Mark Bell, another legend in the reptile industry that we sadly don't have time to talk about in detail today, who sold snakes such as corn snakes to the Pet Vendor, and eventually Brian began buying snakes from him directly. By the time he was 16 or 17, Brian had already amassed hundreds of snakes in his mother's basement, already experimenting with breeding, with his first breeding pair being a pair of corn snakes. In 1986, Mark Bell purchased 40 albino Burmese pythons from Bob Clark, another legend we will sadly pass by quickly today, as albino Burms had become the first true investment, quote-unquote, reptile. Brian spent his last $3,200 to purchase a pair from Mark, and his dream of working with reptiles for a living became a little closer to reality, as he was able to raise the babies up and breed them. Shortly after his purchase of the albino Burmese python, Brian met Lori at a local party. After eventually going on a first date, Brian proudly proclaimed to his mom that he had met his future wife, and he was not wrong about that. I should take a step back really quickly and just explain that at this point in his career, breeding snakes for a living was not a thing. People would go to reptile shows and trade reptiles, sure, but actually making a living on it was just kind of starting to emerge, and as we'll see, Brian played a huge role in that. By the early 1990s, in fact, a lot had happened in Brian's personal and professional life. He had married Lori, and they had a daughter named Jade. Later on in 1998 or 1999, a few years down the road, the family would welcome their second child named Noah, who up until recently prominently featured in the vlogs. Yet professionally, in the early 1990s, Brian and Lori had still failed to separate themselves from other breeders, but that was about to change. Sometime during the early 1990s, a friend from Germany contacted the couple saying a customer had brought in an albino Honduran milk snake to the store and offered Brian a pair. With no evidence of what was actually being presented, and barely getting the snakes through customs, and nearly losing one during the unboxing process, Brian and Lori had secured the first albino Hondurans in the country. That pushed Brian to become a headline breeder, finally etching his name in reptile breeding history in the US. His more significant contributions, however, would be right around the corner. Remember before how I mentioned that one of Brian's first loves when it came to reptiles was the ball python? Well, around this time, Brian began to take a more serious interest in ball python morphs. While the infant reptile industry centered itself around albino Burmese pythons and colubrids, a small group, including Brian, Kevin McCurley from Nerd, and Dave and Tracy Barker from BPI, along with a couple others, began to seriously work with the ball python mutations that were being shipped from Africa. They faced much ridicule in the beginning, but slowly but surely, people began to take ball pythons more seriously, especially when the pied ball python proved out for $25,000 each. Suddenly, ball pythons weren't being made fun of by breeders, and breeders who had previously made fun of them began selling their whole collections to get into the ball python industry. Now, Brian, as an early adopter of ball pythons and seeing their potential, was positioned extremely well for the ball python craze of the 90s and 2000s. I cannot possibly go into the explosive rise of the ball python industry in this video, or it would be 30 minutes on its own, nor can I go through every one of Brian's stories from this era. In this video, I'll kind of go over some highlights from his career from here on out with breeding, and luckily for you, if you want to learn more about the ball python industry, you can go check out one of his many podcasts, or maybe one day I'll make a video about it. So here's how the business model worked. You would buy a ball python sight unseen from Africa and ship it into the country and hope that you could prove it out genetically. And once you did that, you'd have a bunch of babies and you'd sell them all to one person. You'd essentially create your own competitor, but for a steep price on their end. One of Brian's major early projects was the pinstripe ball python in the late 90s, a snake he bought for $27,000 sight unseen. As mentioned before with the pied ball python, he also paid $25,000 for that, then lost the animal, but was sent more out of the kindness of the seller's heart. This major boom led to Brian eventually amassing the second largest collection of reptiles, period. He describes this period as very boom or bust, with some years being incredible, and other years being ones where he could barely scrape by with the business. By late 2007, Brian decided to expand his operation beyond just breeding snakes. Noticing the rise of the internet and platforms like YouTube, he decided to film a weekly show on life as a reptile mega breeder and post it to his channel under the banner of Snake Bites. These weekly videos were a hit, increasing Brian's fame beyond just the breeding circle and into the minds of the general reptile keeper and public alike. Brian's business continued to expand during this time into lizards like bearded dragons, leopard geckos, and even a short-lived attempt to breed night Nile monitors. Brian's vision when it came to breeding continued to help him pump out world's first after world's first. In 2013, after several attempts, Brian successfully produced the world's first scaleless ball python and was offered over $100,000 for it. Nowadays, we know the scaleless ball python has many issues, but it still stands as a crowning achievement for Brian and ball python breeding. Now, over the years of becoming a mega breeder, Brian had learned to love the education side of the hobby more and more, and had become dissuaded with the mega breeding that he was engaging in. By 2016, BHB had downsized to a smaller building so Brian could focus on working with reptiles and not numbers, as he describes it. His son Noah also suggested that Brian pick up vlogging his daily activities, as that was becoming a fast trend on YouTube. So on May 16th, 2016, Brian released the first video to his vlog channel. This larger shift into education media was highlighted by his production of Brian in the Wild, a documentary in Africa that you can actually watch on his YouTube channel. During 2016, Brian also participated in Venom Hunters, where he and his old buddy Chewy from Snake Bites teamed back up to catch the world's most venomous snakes in Australia to collect venom. These early vlogs showed Brian's life breeding snakes and lizards in what was still one of the largest reptile collections in the US. During the first year of vlogging, however, Brian began to think more about keeping reptiles and began to think how he could educate more people and let them get hands-on. On December 17, 2016, he announced that he had secured an adjacent building to build his own reptile zoo for the public. And 2 years later, on September 23, 2018, the YouTube world got to watch as the zoo opened up for visitors. This event marked a massive shift in Brian's career, shifting his priorities from breeding to education through zoo work. For years, Brian had done pet on-the-go events, but this was the first time it really became a priority, and that's a shift we'll continue to see over time. This time wasn't all happy though. As I mentioned in his tribute video that I made almost a year ago now, Brian had a falling out of sorts with the reptile industry in January of 2018. I'm not going to go into the full details of the spider ball python saga, but the gist is this. The spider ball python mutation comes with beautiful patterns, but also neurological problems which cause a head wobble which can severely impact the life of the snake. Brian, being one of the early breeders of this morph along with others similar to it, took to defending the breeding of the morph. This, along with other perceived injustices, led to immense bullying and hatred of Brian. It was on January 28th, 2018, that Brian released a 27-minute video discussing his experience through the bullying. A video that is both gut-wrenching and a moment that really helps break down the mental stigma around discussing cyberbullying and mental health, especially online. Brian's community rallied behind him, and though pockets of the reptile community continued to despise Brian, he didn't let it stop him from doing what he loved. Just over a year later, as Brian fell more in love with the education side of running a zoo, on November 15th, 2019, he announced plans to expand the reptile zoo, doubling its size and showing off many more species. Once again, the whole process from demolition to opening was vlogged, and it finally opened on March 17th, 2020. March 17th, 2020. Well, that's great timing. Brian's huge expansion plan was quickly shut down by the pandemic, and for months remained in limbo. Throughout this process, the vlogs, as well as BHB Reptiles, kept Brian's struggling empire afloat. When finally the Reptarium was allowed to open its doors to guests, it was a huge relief for everyone on the crew. When they did open their doors, they found even more guests ready to come than usual, and have continued to have massive success since the reopening. It was also during this time that Brian's impact was among its greatest, as people were inside but learning about reptiles and getting reptiles. After surviving what had up to this point been the toughest challenge he had faced, Brian was already beginning the early stages of expanding again in early 2022, this time to his biggest project yet, a full-scale aquarium and reptile zoo. This aquarium would finally be his masterpiece, encompassing his lifelong love of reptiles in the biggest homes possible, along with his lifelong love of fish. By the late in the year 2022, Brian had bought a 30,000 square foot building as his canvas for the ultimate facility to educate guests. Unfortunately, many of you may know that as we're nearing the end of the video, something bad had to be coming. On March 5th, 2023, Brian Barczyk officially announced his diagnosis of pancreatic cancer, one of the deadliest cancers and in his case practically inoperable. This devastating diagnosis halted work on the Legacy Aquarium for a couple months as the Barczyk family considered whether to go through with it at all. In the end, Brian decided to fight against the cancer with near impossible odds, and to fight to open this aquarium and be there on opening day. As I write this script, the aquarium is still a ways from being completed, though it's getting closer by the day, but unfortunately Brian's life has long since come to a close. Looking at his life, it's incredible to look back at that boy raised in a working single mother home, and seeing him now as his family looks to complete a full aquarium, having educated 2+ billion people online and hundreds of thousands more in person. One of Brian's main characteristics throughout his whole career was extremely hard work, often not sleeping a lot as he worked into the nights on projects. I would be remiss if I didn't take a few moments to mention that none of this would have been possible without the help of his partner for life, Lori. Throughout his life, it has been said many times that the only reason Brian was able to get anything done at all was because of Lori. While Brian was a dreamer, she was the one that unfortunately, or fortunately for him if you want to look at it from that perspective, had to rein him in and decide how to actually run a business. She was thrust into this life, and though she never asked for it, she accepted the role with glee and enthusiasm, and that's an incredibly powerful and rare thing, to have someone support your dreams. As much as the Legacy Aquarium is Brian's legacy, it's also Lori's legacy as well, a legacy of 40 years working towards the same goal with somebody that you've spent your entire life with. And I can't help feeling that the completion of this saga will mark an exciting but daunting new chapter in her life as well as the rest of the Barczyk family. I don't want to understate her impact, even though through a large part of the middle video, it kind of seemed like I didn't talk about her as much, and that was kind of always the point. is that Brian would be the face of it while she ran the actual business. But now, as she steps into the spotlight a little bit more on the vlog channel, we've gotten to see more of the person that actually made everything happen. All these grand projects wouldn't have been able to be completed without a mind like hers and a patience like hers. Brian went from one of the most successful breeders supplying people with pets to one of the most influential reptile educators on the planet in his time, becoming as great a figure in the reptile community as Steve Irwin in his own way in this digital age. Though Brian's life was tragically cut short, his memory and legacy lives on both through this aquarium, but also his incredible family who continue to follow Brian's vision of educating people on the animals that he loved. Thank you, everyone.